I was hard-pressed to name it. It was an underlying syndrome of sorts that permeates my very being. It operates like a drone, a dull, droning sound, always present, that most of the time is drowned out by my higher pitches of optimism and hope. I now know it to be Black fatigue. This is the Inclusion Solution Live, the Winters Group podcast for all things diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. My name is Mary Frances Winters, and I will be your host for this series where we will explore the many layers of Black fatigue. Dr. Shannon Sullivan, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about Black fatigue. So as you know, we're doing a series of sessions with people who have something to say about the concepts that I write about in my book. And I started writing this book as a result of hearing from so many millennials, actually, that they were really just tired of having to tell white people or share with white people or teach white people what it's like to live as a Black person. And I thought I'm a baby boomer, so I thought for me, I said, well, isn't that what I'm supposed to do? Am I supposed to help people understand? But I was hearing something different. I kept hearing, I am just fatigued. And so we're going to talk about how your work intersects perhaps with some of the work that I'm doing. But why don't you just tell our listeners right now just a little bit about who you are, what you do, and how you came into the work that you do.
Sure. So thank you again for having this conversation with me. I'm Shannon Sullivan, and I'm a professor of philosophy and health psychology at UNC Charlotte. And I work primarily in critical philosophy of race, feminist philosophy, and critical whiteness studies. And I came into this work that increasingly focuses on whiteness and white privilege and related concepts. I almost want to say sort of accidentally. A lot of it came through teaching, trying to help my students understand material that was, of course, intellectually challenging, but could also be personally challenging. And so when I was talking to students, sometimes about feminist concepts, I would see male students in the back of the room looking pretty uncomfortable and pretty unhappy. And I was trying to think, how can I reach out to them in a way to help them hear this material and get past some of the barriers, and hostility is not quite the word, but just barriers. It was difficult material. And I started asking myself, well, what would I feel like as a white person if we were talking about race? And I had this aha moment of realizing no one's ever talked to me about that. I've never really thought about that. Not that there's not that those are parallel. There's all sorts of interesting intersections there, but it was a moment of realizing I've got to think a whole lot more philosophically and otherwise about what whiteness is and how it's structuring my relationship to other people, scholarly enterprises, all sorts of things. And so that kind of led down an ongoing path of exploring critically what whiteness is, and maybe most importantly, how to transform it.
Great, thank you. So you wrote a book, I think it was 2014, right? That was called was Good White People.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
So tell me, how did you get there, and tell me about the thesis around that book.
So I'd been interested in writing for a while around what I call unconscious habits of race, unconscious habits of whiteness and white privilege and white domination and white supremacy. And as a follow-up to that, because I think a lot of this nowadays does operate unconsciously, but that makes it no less insidious as a result. And I began to explore the ways in which I think that what I call good white people are a major obstacle for progress toward racial justice. And that a sort of class division gets going or gets established between the so-called good white people who supposedly aren't responsible for racism, they're enlightened or something, kind of post-Jim Crow. And then there's supposedly the bad white people that are the problem. If there's any lingering racism, it's that small group of the really explicit, big-booted white supremacists that are the problem. And a nice, very psychologically comfortable, sharp line supposedly exists between the two. And it's a way of absolving so-called regular good white people from any kind of responsibility or connection or implication in ongoing racial injustice. And so I wrote a lot about the habits of good white people. And it's not pretty. There are a lot of ways I think that white people dump responsibility for racism onto other people and just try to morally absolve themselves of it.
So what are some of those habits of good white people?
One is, as I've alluded to, dumping problems of racism on the so-called bad white people.
Okay.
So another one is really demonizing parts of history. So you look back at white slaveholders, or back when lynching activities from the Klan and others were at a high point, say at the end of the 19th century or early part of the 20th century. You look back and demonize and say, how could white people have been like, isn't it so great we're not like that anymore? It was so awful back then. And it's a way of it's not a way of reckoning with one's history. It's a way of demonizing it to morally absolve the present as if it's innocent. It's like a quest for white innocence. I think another form it takes is very interested in white child rearing, which freaks people out when you say that. How white people rear children who are white. And most of the times, the good white people do it through so-called color blindness. And this becomes a way to allow racism, and anti-Black racism in particular, to just hum along unnoticed and replicate itself. But all of it looking very innocent, very, morally responsible and good.
I know, I remember being in a store a number of years ago, and a little kid says to her mother, Mommy, there's a brown person, talking about me. And I said, shh, don't say that, right? And so sometimes, I would say something like, oh, gee, how precocious. She knows her colors really well.
Yeah.
Right? We're supposed to deny it or not see it. And it was just, the innocence of a child, right? Just,
Innocence, silence, lots of shushing children's questions,
right.
And some of it, I get it. I'm a white person. There's some awkwardness. White people don't have a lot of experience. Most white people, I would say, don't have a lot of experience with family members and friends talking in kind of thoughtful or critical or rich ways about race and their own whiteness. So if you talk about race, and especially if you talk about whiteness, the fear is everyone's going to turn around and think you're a Klan member, like you're about to pull the white hood out of your purse and put it on right there in the grocery store or something. And so the safest way to make it everyone, it's like signaling, hey, it's okay. I'm not one of those bad ones.
Right.
You shush them, you silence it, you don't say a word about it. And it just allows everything else to replicate and keep going.
Yeah. I've been thinking about, Robin DiAngelo's really popular book about white fragility. And it's actually, that was one of the reasons that I wanted to write Black Fatigue. So I said, yeah, if there's white fragility, there's certainly Black fatigue. But as I've been thinking more and more about this concept of white fragility, this has come to me like over the past month, I'm saying, I don't know. I'm saying, white people seem to me like they're more entitled than they are fragile. So we do a lot of work with corporations, and the corporate people tell us, you can't say that because we don't want to make our leaders feel uncomfortable. And so, that's really just so uncomfortable. And even the leaders will say, as a result of what's just happened over the past few months, that George Floyd incident sparked, the momentum for renewed interest in racial justice. And CEOs of large corporations say, it's just so uncomfortable for me to talk about racism. I don't know if that's fragility more so than it is, I'm entitled. I don't have to talk about it. So when I wrote in my blog last week about who's really fragile, I was thinking about Black and brown kids. I was thinking about these who, from a very early age, are told. And I know the first time I knew that I was different or that my color mattered when I was in kindergarten. And sometimes I've been in kindergarten, but I remember that incident so well. I remember who it was. I remember his name. I remember and because from that moment, it transformed me from this little kid who was just carefree and to this like, what? like somebody might not like me because of my skin. And think about a 5-year-old like trying to like reason that. I'm trying to figure out. So I became, more like this. So this notion of white fragility, I'm like wondering, well, who's really fragile in all of this? So anyway, I just want to get your thoughts on that.
I think you're right that that white fragility helps, it becomes a mechanism for producing a lot of Black fatigue. Because if white people are that fragile, and I find the concept both useful and like sometimes problematic kind of bundled into one. Like, it's true white people are fragile, and isn't that convenient? You almost find this like active work to maintain the fragility, because what it means is the emotional labor of dealing with our social political world and all the problems and issues and everything that comes up around it, all of that gets dumped on people of color, right? It's, and there's a lot of emotional labor. I'm really interested in talk about the fatigue that comes from the emotional labor of making sure that white people, and gender gets interesting here too, making sure white women feel safe and comfortable and not threatened. Because the minute they start feeling too uncomfortable and threatened, white women, their fragility and that need, I think of the fragility is sort of a way of maintaining the supposed innocence. And so that cannot be threatened. And if it is, you see that harsh hand behind there, just literally or metaphorically slapping down whoever it was that made that white person feel uncomfortable. So a lot of, not just Black men, but Black people in general, and people of color in general. But I think a lot of this work gets done by Black people, or it's demanded in some unspoken way that you tiptoe around this and that, or you smile in a certain way, or you make sure that white woman in the elevator does not start to get too uncomfortable. And the anxiety that creates then for, say, that Black person on the elevator is what often isn't looked at. We talk about the white woman and why does she feel so threatened and what's going on there. But what just went on physiologically, emotionally, health-wise for that Black person who had to do all that emotional interpersonal labor out of, what they could refuse to do the labor, and that might help reduce some of the fatigue, but there are lots of dangers that can come with that too.
And it's just for existing, right? It's just for being. It's not for doing anything except being, right? I'm in this elevator, so I'm here. I am just being, and I'm thinking about all of these, the anxiety that this might be causing this white person who's also there. So I'm thinking too, Shannon, that as I've been thinking about this white fragility thing, that it's really a power thing here, because white women, and I don't want to generalize too much, but white women use the fragility as power.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. There's a sociologist in Canada who has this great phrase about tears, fears, and careers, but it's looking at the kinds of I'm not saying every white woman cries, but this fear, and then if it gets too uncomfortable, often crying, that this is and then all of a sudden the attention's on the white woman who's somehow been hurt or harmed because the discussion got too angry. Maybe there was an angry Black person or something. And so it really does become a power move to deflect away from what was supposed to be the issue at hand, which was dealing with racial injustice. Now it turns into a focus about, again, somehow the white person was the one being harmed in all this. Exactly. And now we have to work to protect that person again. Yeah. And that's power. And it's power, and it's not often on a conscious level. Like, I don't think white people often, maybe sometimes some do, but it's not that they have to sit around and consciously go, how can I manipulate this situation so that I keep the power, et cetera, et cetera. All of this, I think, can happen in a very unconscious way, in and through some of this emotional, interpersonal sorts of dynamics that we've been talking about.
So it's how you've been socialized in a way, right? How white women and white people in general, how they've been socialized. I think, and I used the term entitlement before, but let's the meme, the Karen meme, right? Mm-hmm. So the Karen meme, it is really that is about power too, and that's about why am I entitled to ask a couple who are building a deck on the back of their home? Why am I entitled to ask them if they have a permit to build that deck? I mean, what? I would never think of asking anybody who's building a deck or doing anything, if they're if they have the right to do that. They're in their yard, right? The little kid who was selling, bottles of water, like the lemonade stand, but it was the water stand. Do you have a permit, for this? Should you be barbecuing here? So all of those things, to me, that's not fragility.
No, that's not fragility. I think the Karen phenomenon is not fragility at all. It is aggressive, and it's got a lot of anger in the guise of these. I have to think about if all the examples fit this, but a lot of them fit very explicitly trying to use the law. I mean, sometimes it might be a community regulation, but
right,
some
exactly.
kind of community regulation or law, very aggressively using that in targeted ways to dampen, hinder, harass people of color. Yeah. It's just pure out aggression.
Right. Yeah, it's some kind of rule, right? But even when I'm breaking the rule, like the Central Park situation with the Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper, they're not related, but Christian Cooper was the bird watcher.
Right.
Cooper had her dog unleashed, which was against the ordinance because the dogs can scare the birds. And she, totally went off in terms of feeling that she was threatened. And so that's the entitlement that I see, just even I can break the rules, right? And if I want to break the rules, I'm entitled to do that. I used to see that. So I used to fly, before the pandemic, I flew a lot. And I would notice, this happened several times, where a white person would come and would be in my seat or come and sit next to me and then have to move. And it was like, when they would be in my seat and I say, oh, I think that's my seat. Oh, yeah, probably is. Just, there's one, mine's behind you. Just take that one. I was like, no, that's the one I was assigned. And then, so I'm in the wrong because I want to have my seat. That's what I guess that's what I'm getting at in terms of the sort of the entitlement I see more so than the fragility. But anyway, that was just something that I've been thinking about, so we can move on. What are your thoughts about the current racial climate that we're finding ourselves in today?
I mean, I think of a couple of things in connection with that. I think some of the racism and white supremacy is really naked and explicit in ways that, in some ways, but not always, is different than the past. I think a lot of good white people feel sort of shocked at how naked it is. But, and so that's, and maybe are even becoming aware of how much anti-Black and other forms of racism are out there. And so, it's okay, that's good. You sort of question, why did it take getting that naked before white people noticed it? But okay, let's say that. One of the things I worry about, though, is that surprise or that being upset, thinking about the George Floyd murder and other things. It is way too early for, as I've heard some people ask or wonder, are things really changing now because white people really get it and they're out there protesting now, really going to white people protest in the 50s, at least some. And it's way too early to think, though, that there's been a real change in habits of whiteness. Where and I hate to sound too cynical, but it's way too early for us to know, as some people have wondered, if this is going to have some staying power. I'm not convinced that it will or that it does. And I also worry that some of the upset about the real explicit racism that I think is floating around in US society and some different political and other venues right now, I worry that what white people want, they won't say it this way explicitly, but what they want is for it to go back the way it was before, which in my ears is, it's still there. It's just dialed down a few notches so it's not quite as overt or explicit, because that makes us white people feel uncomfortable. We're back to the white fragility, but as a power play, as a kind of cover for a desire to keep racial injustice in place, for white people to have priority, for them to have the entitlement, for the rules to apply to them only when they want to, but when they don't, all the things we've been talking about. So I really worry that it's just going to take a lot more and a lot longer to know if there's any kind of more substantial change going on versus just the kind of white plea that and not all white people are upset about currently what's going on with more explicit racism and more explicit white supremacy, but the ones who are just want it to be, could we go back to where it was done a little more politely and not quite as rudely? And that's it.
Yeah, because it's hard work, right? I mean, we're talking about dismantling, systems that are, centuries old. And in order to do it, you have to stay with it. I've been doing this work now for 36 years. And so it's not the first time I've been around. I mean, here we go again. But it's just too hard. And, change happens when the pain of staying where you are is greater than the pain of, doing something else. And the pain for white people didn't get greater until we started to see the protests and whatnot. And so typically, what it takes for any social movement, right? There's always, if it's about race, if it's about labor, it's about, women's rights, whatever, there's always thing that is that related to violence that causes people to take notice and to change. And so I agree with you, because I'm already seeing in my practice, already seeing some pushback, already seeing, that first 3 weeks in June, we were so busy. I mean, we just couldn't keep up with the demand for, can you do a town hall for us? Can you talk about the history of racism? We want to, can you talk to our Black employees and do some healing sessions? Oh my goodness, blah, blah, blah. And everything had to be done, that sense of urgency, right? Everything had to be done this week. We cannot wait, it has to be done. And so now we're already seeing that, it's not as urgent anymore, and it's not as, and people have kind of gone back to normal. My colleagues say that somebody said that she's in a diversity role in an organization, said, didn't we talk about that last month? Are we still talking about that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just this kind of short attention span that we have, and we're on to the next. I think that what's going on with the way Trump is dividing, I really believe he is dividing the country, and banning anti-racism training in the government. My perspective is that with people who are against it don't really understand what it is. They take a sound bite and they say, "Oh, we're telling all white people that they're racist." Well, I think what we're saying is that we live in a racialized world. Such we are all, I don't use the word victims, but I guess victims of that racialized world, and it's hoping to have people take collective accountability for that. That's the message, and I know my colleagues are in this work. But when you take it out of context and you say all white people are racist, what does that do? And how do we fix that narrative to be able to make it more like we really are trying to get to unity. We really are trying to get to equity. But in order to do that, like you use the term naked, we've got to kind of take all the clothes off and, really start.
Yeah, I mean, I can't prove this in any kind of way, but when you match sort of the behaviors and the words of white people don't match. And I look at the behaviors. White people don't want racial equity. And I'm not saying that's not targeted at any particular white person. I'm speaking generally. Of course, there's all the things that people will jump on when they hear me say that. But if you stop looking at the words, because the words make white people look nice, justice and equity. And of course we want fairness, and we're a nation that kind of set the words aside and look at the behavior. Why are you still working on the very same thing 36 years later? Is because white people don't want it to change. Now that's not necessarily at a conscious level, but I just don't think the conscious level is the fuel motivating a lot of this. And until white people really feel that they have skin in the game, they're just gonna keep digging in, and they don't want it to change. I mean, so banning the anti-racism trainings is shocking, but it sort of just makes explicit and says out loud in a way what I think was kind of there for a while. I think in one of the descriptions, or sort of when I think about your book, Black Fatigue, one of the comments or descriptions around it is about how it's paradoxical that there's been all this attention focused for the last 50 years or so on social justice and diversity and inclusion, but there really hasn't been that much progress made. And all of a sudden the paradox disappears and we go, because white people don't really want that. They ended Jim Crow because of the pain. But they didn't, most of them, us, didn't think I mean, I was only born then, but they didn't think I have to put myself in this group. We didn't really think there was skin in the game. It was just, how do we get this pain to go away? And you can see, I think the last 50 years post Jim Crow, as finding new ways for the privileging and prioritizing of white people to rearrange themselves in a post-Jim Crow world so they can carry on just in new and different ways. Just the behaviors don't line up. If the people in power wanted some of these things to change, they'd help put some resources, time and energy behind changing it. And we white people just don't do that.
Right, yeah.
And that tells you what we really believe.
Right, and I've seen that in terms of resources. They will hire and put in place the chief diversity officers and actually pay them a lot of money. And I'm going to say it right out loud. In essence, they're buying the silence. They're buying them to maintain the status quo, because if you're paid $500,000 a year or whatever that salary is, and you can now have some things that you probably couldn't have had before, right? So you become part of the system of maintaining the status quo. So yes, I agree that I don't think, and so therefore here we are, Black fatigue. So generations.
So no wonder Black people are fatigued.
Yeah, exactly.
It shouldn't surprise anyone.
It shouldn't surprise anyone, right? And so when talking with the younger generation, I almost feel like guilty that, I've devoted my life's work to this, and my generation didn't really get there. I mean, we got there in a way, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I was, just a child then, but I came into the work actually in the 70s. And so we have seen some, some progress. I mean, you can't explicitly discriminate against anybody. Again, you can't say I'm not hiring you because you're Black.
Right.
You can say I'm not hiring you because you have a Black sounding name. But that's unconscious, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So I think that, we are we're really stuck. And I know that you have done some work around this intergenerational fatigue that leads to health issues. So let's talk about that a little bit, because I do reference your work in epigenetics. Is that
Yes.
I learned that as I was researching the book. So let's talk a little bit about the intergenerational impact of Black fatigue.
Yeah, I mean, and with the kind of a warning to the audience how much of a downer this topic can be, because I'm real careful to not talk about the permanence. Derek Bell will talk about the permanence of racism in the United States, and I don't want to use that term, but there's a real durability, and it's durable because of some very deep ways the impact of racism gets into physiology, the physiology of Black bodies, and on the flip side, we can talk more about the physiology of white bodies here too. But if we're talking about Black fatigue, one thing that's so interesting is to realize, it's not just not getting a good night's sleep, like being tired in that sense. There's a real weathering of Black bodies and other people of color, but let's stick with Black bodies for now, a real weathering that takes place because of the impact of microaggressions and even more macro aggressive stressors that impact Black lives. And so some of the, and they are transgenerational, which I think is both fascinating, but also even if we could eliminate magically right now, snap our fingers and make all racism and white supremacy just disappear. Like not just the laws, but the way people heard Black names and interacted with each other. If we could just snap our fingers and all went away, the effects of ongoing white supremacy and racism for the generations before us would still be there, and they would still be showing up in Black health, in the negative effects on Black health. So some of that has to do with I mean, we can get in the weeds here on some of the physiology about how, we can take the chronological age of two women, one black, one white. Let's say they're 50 years old. So chronologically, they might be both 50 years old, but physiologically, on average, that black woman is 8 years older than the white woman. If you look at the length, the ends of the chromosomes that are called, sometimes I hear telomeres or telomeres. Yeah. And they shorten as we age. And so there's this process of aging that all human beings go through. But we sometimes think what normal aging is. We tend to refer to the white body and call that normal. That's a whole nother issue that we should talk about. But aging as a physiological process happens in different ways depending on the stressors of our environment. And if there's the ongoing racist stress, it's aging that body differently, and it can be passed on. Sometimes this happens through what they call the uterine environment, where the stress that a black woman who's pregnant, the stress hormones that are released there can actually set the markers on the gene in a way that before that baby is born, it will now be more susceptible to stress and the various health effects that go along with that can lead into high blood pressure, hypertension. These are precursors to other problems having to do with diabetes and heart disease, et cetera. So that little baby can be born with, when we talk about epigenetic markers, if everyone wants to, the markers that are on the gene.
Go there. Give us some
Okay.
science.
So there's no such thing as a naked gene. All our genes have markers on them, and one of the most and those markers control whether and to what degree the gene is expressed. And so the markers, methylation is one of the key markers that tends to be talked about. You can think of them as like knobs that turn up or turn down a gene. Now, so depending on what genes, and of course, there's never like just single genes working by themselves, but okay, we've got our genes, but there's no such thing as this executive gene that's like controlling everything, environment on the side. There are all kinds of ways that our environments are the main ways that these chemical markers or chemicals that bond on the outside of the gene control the expression of the gene, and the gene never exists without those markers. So the environment is a co-partner in a very equal way in what's happening to us genetically. So stress in different ways can turn these knobs up and down in ways that can lead to, when they research all this stuff in mice, they start looking at what color is the coat of the mouse and all this kind of stuff. Start looking at humans, it controls a lot of these. So some of the ways that the markers on the genes, this when we're talking about epigenetics instead of just genetics, we're talking about those markers and the expressions of the genes. So one of the indirect ways that that the stress of, say, a mother can be actually physiologically shape and change the body of that baby is through the stress that the mother's dealing with. It affects the markers in the fetus. The fetus is born with those markers set in a way that will make it for the rest of its life, even though that little baby who was a fetus itself has taken one breath of air and never experienced any racism in the world. The effects of the racism on the mother have now methylated in certain ways that baby is susceptible to all sorts of diseases that it wouldn't have been otherwise.
Wow.
Now, and so that's one way in which if we just eliminate it all right now, those effects are still going to be there physiologically. And then there are more direct ways that, and of course we all have stress, and these, but when we're looking at these really salient, significant patterns of stress that show up in our society, racism is one of the key ones. And there's a lot, the preterm birth rates for African American women in the United States are significantly higher than those of white women. And it's not just that they go into labor early and so all the health effects of a prematurely born baby. So we're talking somewhere like 6 weeks early. In addition to those effects, there are the epigenetic effects that I just mentioned. But it also turns out there's some more direct ways that that there can be epigenetic effects, and these start to get, I won't go into all the details, but these start to get even more striking in terms of it not just being the so-called uterine environment of that fetus that's affecting the newborn baby and whether its epigenetic structure has been set in such a way that it's prone to disease. There does seem to be evidence for, so usually our epigenetic markers, they're sort of wiped clean. You start with a clean slate, so to speak. When that egg and the sperm come together, there is this clean slate of the epigenetic, the markers starting fresh. And that's why they always thought that epigenetics is not something that can be passed down. This kind of marking that we're seeing can't be passed down directly in the way that genes are passed down directly from parent to child. The epigenetic markers have to be reestablished in each generation so that there's a fresh start, supposedly. Okay, so already weathering, even though they're marked clean, so to speak, those epigenetic markers, when the little zygote is there, as that zygote's turning into a fetus, its markers are getting adjusted by the mother's stress. So that is a clean slate, and yet that environment changing the epigenetic markers. But there's evidence now of what gets called genomic imprinting. So that even, okay, so zygote kind of gets, we get the clean wash there with the egg and sperm coming together, but that there's an imprinting that happens in the sperm and the egg where it looks like the the markers are being shifted and changed. And so there's evidence, for example, and one of the ways you can really track this is looking down a paternal line instead of a maternal line. Because anytime you're looking maternally, you can say, well, wasn't that just what happened in the womb, in the uterus? And so yes, it's being handed down. It's still transgenerational, but it's not really directly handed down physiologically. But there's evidence in examples of some of these Swedish famines that happened back in World War II and earlier. The Swedes evidently kept these really detailed crop records, and they know exactly when various famines happened, how many calories people got. And you can see on a paternal line, when a grandfather went through a famine, 2 generations later, you can see the health effect on the grandson who had never himself experienced famine. And it went through the paternal line. This is not because in the uterus, let's say, the mom didn't have enough food. It wasn't that. So there's a lot of evidence, and there's some evidence around smokers too, and some of that affecting some epigenetic markers going down the paternal line and lasting 4 generations. So something back there that happened 2 to 4 generations ago with a famine on the dad's line is affecting the health of that grandson in terms of some of the markers and things that they can see. So they're now true epigenetic transmission in a very direct way, we know happens with plants. It's less common in mammals because mammals are just so much more complicated. But there are enough of these sort of cases to begin to ask questions about, it just might not be so simple as only the genes get passed down, none of this other stuff does. It's environment and it's secondary. There really seems to be a co-constitution physiologically there. Why does all that matter in the context of racism? Again, it matters because stress of any form, but stress is one of these huge environmental factors that turns up and down these markers on our genes. And so if you have patterns of real systematic stress directed at a race of people get marked as African American, you're literally constructing them physiologically in ways through those targeted racialized stressors that there will be these physiological effects for generations. And you, in effect, like race isn't biological in the sense that we come with little black and white genes or anything else, but we actually start creating racialized differences in health in and through racist practice. So it's not race and then racism, it's racism starts to create racial differences that then we have to grapple with and reckon with, because they don't just go away quickly.
Yeah, that was so amazing. Thank you for sharing that, because you shared it in a way that I think the audience will be able to understand, in lay terms. I read your paper on epigenetics, and it got a bit dense for me in terms of just, being able to understand, but you really explained it well. And so does that also then explain some of why we see these studies about college-educated, middle-class Black women who are still, I think the statistic, I don't remember quite, but I think it's twice as likely
Yes.
to have
Yes.
premature babies, but also their own health. Aren't they taught at some number as likely to die in childbirth, even?
Not as it may be. I'm not as familiar with the rates of maternal death, but
Mhm,
definitely it's twice as high to have preterm birth and then all the
mhm,
complications for the new baby that come from that. And then that baby will, so then you also start to see, and this begins to answer some of those questions. Why do you begin to see, not in every family, but why do you begin to see a pattern of preterm births of women in African American families?
mhm,
And it now one answer could be environment in a very macro sense of
mhm.
but your point's right there. But wait a minute, it's not just socioeconomic. What
Right.
if there is all the prenatal care? What if there's plenty of income for good food and all
Mhm,
the vitamins and whatever, and you still see in these families many times grandmother, mother, and then that daughter preterm birth rates
mhm.
being very, very high, and all the dangers that go along with that. And there's this one doctor who said at one point, he's like, there's just something about being a Black female in the United States that's bad for their reproductive health. And we just can't figure out what it is, what's going on. And then for a little while, they were even looking for a preterm birth gene and wondering if
Wow.
Africa, and then you're just like, how far do we go to
Right.
avoid looking at the obvious that maybe it has
Right.
something to do with racism? So
Yeah. Yeah.
there's more attention being paid to that now, but there literally was for a while an attempt to look for, I think it was when we were like mapping the whole human genome, and this
Mhm.
fantasy about 15 years ago, if we could find the gene for everything, they start looking for the preterm birth gene to see if African American women have it.
Ah, wow.
There's no such thing. Everyone should
Yeah.
know that. There's no such thing.
So just like in other aspects of society, where we think that the leveler, the great leveler, is education, which will then lead to socioeconomic, the different socioeconomic level and status. We find that in what you've just been talking about in terms of health outcomes, that's not the case. We find that in other instances, I read something that said that a Black person who is raised middle class has as high a likelihood of in adulthood being in poverty as a poor white person who, in terms of generation. So when we think that uh, the impact of racism is going to lessen from generation to generation, get better from generation, that's not the case in many, not just in health, but in socioeconomics, in all of the different aspects that we might look at it, So socioeconomics obviously has to do with housing and all those kinds of things. As you look at that, I mean, all of the indicators that you would say
Mm-hmm.
education doesn't seem to fix it, right?
It's true. It does not. It does not. Um, it, I mean, I'm sure it's still a good thing that can help in some ways, but I mean, we know actually racial disparities in wealth have gone up since the end of Jim Crow.
Right.
They haven't gone down.
Right.
And it's actually the same thing's true for disparities in health. And so you start, and so, right. I mean, all these studies are very careful when they're looking at race. They control for what they call SES, socioeconomic status.
Right.
So they're looking at obviously economics, but just kind of level of education, jobs that people have. And so that SES does play a factor, but it turns out it does not collapse into race. It's not the case that if we only looked at socioeconomic factors, that would take care of everything. Right. There is a separate factor having to do with race that when you control in the study for everything else, it's still there.
It's still there. It's still there, right? And that is Black fatigue.
Yeah.
It's just generations of knowing that you can get all of the education, you can do all of the right things, you can say all of the right things, and all of those, everything that is supposed to be, quote, what the dominant group would say, this is what you're supposed to do. And there's still disproportionality as it relates to outcomes, as it relates to race. And we're tired, and there's and I call it intergenerational fatigue. I mean, we're fatigued, and we probably don't know it. Oftentimes, we just think that this is just the way life is. It's just the way. You just sort of know that you have to manage this way. And I wrote the book because even and the publisher initially with the book concept, so who is the book for? Black people, right? I'm like, no, because really for white people. Because as Black people, we know we're fatigued.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think it's for both, because as Black people, we don't often correlate our symptoms with
Mm-hmm.
living with racism, because that's been normalized for us.
Mm-hmm.
It's just it's just how we, how we operate, so, my son, Joe, who's a associate professor at Duke University, in the religion department. And I worry about him all the time, because he's a tall Black man, and he's the most compassionate, caring, sort of laid back kind of person that you could ever know. And I'm biased as a mom, but his friends say that, and his professors say that too.
But I know him. I can vouch for what
You can
just
vouch
said.
for him? Okay,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
However, he could be targeted, and
Mm-hmm.
because of who he is, and what he looks like. And I write about it in the book, from the time he was, when he was 12 years old, he was in the back seat of a police car, and I came home from work and they said the suspect has been apprehended. I'm like, the suspect has been apprehended? What are you talking about? And apparently he had gotten into a fight with a kid who had been bullying him, a white kid who had been bullying him for weeks. Joe was never a fighter. He was never that. And he said, I finally just punched him because he kept egging me on. He kept asking me to do it. And so rather than the parent coming to the parents and saying, hey, I think our kids got into something here, the father called the police. that was his first thing to do, call the police.
Mm-hmm.
And Joe is in the back of a police car, and he's saying the suspect has been, I will never, as a mother, you would never, the suspect.
No, yeah.
And Joe and I had this conversation just recently about that incident, and he said, the police told him, they said, we didn't handcuff you this time. He said, but if it happens again, we're going to take you in. He's 12 years old.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and this was in a suburb of, Rochester, New York, where he grew up.
I mean, that example points to how, like one of the roots of this United States, it does not matter how much education or family stability or money or whatever else that Black person has, they're still criminalized. They're still seen as an implicit criminal, and it takes one little misstep, or maybe not even that, maybe just a white woman looking the wrong way, right. and you can get criminalized like that. And so some of it could take the form of, we've had a description of a tall Black man in the area who's, boom, all the tall Black men can all of a sudden, the police will be on. But yeah, that example, that it doesn't change the way Blackness in general, but maybe this is true for Black girls and women too. But okay, I think of Black boys and men are criminalized, and the effects of that play out. And then, but it's a form of terror, because that it doesn't happen. The way terrorism works, it doesn't have to happen to every Black 12-year-old or every Black family, but everyone knows it could happen, right. And it happens enough to know it at any moment. So there's the on edge. There's the chronic stressor that fatigues. Stress isn't always bad if you have this moment of doing the ropes course and there's the stress of doing it, and then your body relaxes. And these chronic stressors, it's like an engine that revs, maybe low to medium, but it revs every day, all day. Yeah. And that weathers, that fatigues.
Right, yeah.
And it's not just, it's not that you've ever said this, but I just want your audience to know that fatigue, it's not just like feeling tired like you need a nap. The physiological body is getting ground down. And so that's the basis for everything, emotional, spiritual. So I don't mean that to sound, there's always a danger of that sounding like Black people are just being like crushed to dust from all of this. And that's not true. But
right. No,
they're real effects.
Yeah, because we've learned to not only survive but thrive, and a lot of times it's through our faith. A lot of times it's through, the Black church is very, as you know, very important in Black people's lives. And sometimes as I experience worship and I see the passion and the expression and the outlet of just being able to just be in a place where you can just be yourself and just let it all out. let it all out. And so you will see people dancing, and you will, see people, doing the holy dance and all of those kinds of things. And, as I, grew up in that kind of an environment, and still in that environment, it's just something, it's the release. It's the release. And I talk about it in the book from the perspective that, studies have show. I'm a data person at heart, because I'm qualitative and quantitative research is my background. And you see the studies that say that, Black people are much more likely to say that they're religious and they're spiritual than white people. Not that I'm not putting a judgment on that, but I'm just saying that that's a place that we absolutely turn to be able to address it and define what we call, Black joy. So there's a lot of positive, in Black communities to write our own narrative, and to not write a deficit narrative, and to not a narrative that is about, Black fatigue. So I know I'm going to get criticized for saying, why are you writing about something that's so, negative? We need to lift up, right? And the book does, it does lift up. But I think the phenomenon of being, fatigued, and this is passed down from generation to generation because of unmitigated racism. And as you have highlighted today, that you don't really think white people want to get rid of the system, if you will, because the system works. I used to say that a lot about power and privilege kind of training. I was never really a big fan of power and privilege training, because when you tell white people they have power and privilege, well, okay, yeah, thank you very much. Right? I think I want to keep that. It's a good thing. So it never struck me that. And I think I know that I'm being extreme here. Obviously, the message for some white people, resonates. But I think in general, when you tell people that they have power, and what do you want me to do with that power, right? How do I give you some or transfer some to you? We're talking about some of those things now, but still from a systemic way, it just, as you say, it just doesn't happen. So I just want to end this with giving you the sort of the last words. From your perspective, what are some of the solutions to Black fatigue? We've already said really hard, the system hasn't been cracked, but what are some solutions?
Yeah, I think some of it is sort of thinking both short-term and long-term, like all at the same time. Because the long-term solution has got to involve continuing to try and chip away at racial injustice. I don't think that's gonna go away in your and my lifetime, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be. The struggle matters, and there can be change. But that can't be the only answer. There have to be communities of coping, and I mean coping in a way that brings the joy that you're talking about. And so I think communities of color have to find, that can be the church, but it can be other ways too. Ways of like, this is going to sound weird. I think sometimes one of the best things white people can do is leave people of color alone. And by now there's a danger in that, because then, like, we made the mess, we need to help fix it. And that means resources to help. But sometimes in that good white person way of wanting, so, let's integrate everything. Let's have it be, I'm real critical of what I call white people's ontological expansiveness, which is just a fancy word of saying, we feel like it's entitlement. We feel like we have the right to be in any space we want to be in. So if we want to come to that Black church because we think it'd be fun to dance while we're I ought to be able to just walk in. And the way we can destroy a space of healing because it didn't have white people in it, doesn't get paid attention to. So I think there is communities of color, Black communities, I think, talk about taking things out of context. This can sound very segregationist, and I think some of those segregated moments are really important depending on who's choosing them and what they're being used for. White people need to respect that they're just spaces they don't belong in, because we're toxic when we come into them. It does not matter how good my intentions are. If I show up as a white person in that space, it changes it. Now, maybe there's some moments where I'm invited in, and that might be okay. And maybe sometimes there just shouldn't be. But that sense of entitlement, so those spaces. And so one of the things I mean, I know Black people already know about the communities in those power. One thing white people can do, well, first of all, is read your book so we know how damaging and toxic we can be. I mean, I'm not saying all bad people are evil, all white people are evil or anything, but it was an interesting slip right there. But our presence can destroy communities of coping for people of color. And so out of respect, I can stay out of those. Now that can be a disrespect too. You know what, and I'm not arguing for that. So there's real attention to how can there be pushing to get resources distributed in different ways. Racial justice is not coming tomorrow. Can I try and help with my power shift some resources so those communities have them to cope? And can white people work in their own communities and among themselves talking about these problems so that we're not over there expecting people of color to do all that emotional work for us? That takes some of the load off of the fatigue a little.
Yeah.
You take some of that emotional work over to ourselves and not ask you to do it. That help a little. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, yes. And you said this is going to sound weird, but it didn't sound weird at all. And I think it's a great way to end. It's complex. And I think it's some of both. It's some of the both and kind of thing that we get, that we kind of don't do that well, because when you hear things like, I don't want to sound like a segregationist, however, we need some spaces. Yes, but if you say that, then somebody's going to interpret that as meaning that Dr. Shannon Sullivan said
she's getting out the white hood. You know, I've had people like, okay, take it out of context, fine.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's the conversations that we really don't have, to be able to hold space for. It can be a both and. It's not an either or, it's a both and, in the right kind of context in order to get the work done. Well, listen, I want to thank you so very much for taking the time. This has really been amazing. I think it adds a lot to some of the concepts that I talk about in the book. And your book, you have a couple of books out. I know you have the Good White People. You have another one that is?
I have the Physiology of Sexist and Racist Oppression that has that medical physiological data in it. And then I have a smaller little book called White Privilege. In some ways, I think of it as a nice complement to Black fatigue, because that white privilege over here is really fatiguing to Black people. So that one was out last year, the White Privilege book.
Yeah, and those works of Dr. Shannon Sullivan can be found on Amazon, as can my books, which are behind me. But the one we've been talking about most today is Black Fatigue. And people ask me, well, how do Black Fatigue and Inclusive Conversations, which came out in July, there's Inclusive Conversations, how do those work together? If we are ever able to have these inclusive conversations, I think that can lessen Black fatigue. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Dr. Sullivan, for taking the time, and all the best this semester, which is going to be like no other, right, at UNC.
Like no other. Well, thank you, and I'm excited for when the Black Fatigue book is out. It'll be.
Thank you so much.